Hey everyone, and welcome back to your Linux and open source news fix for this week. And this time we have Nvidia CEO saying to kids that they basically should not learn how to code because AI will do that for us in the future. We also have the release of Plasma 6 with all of its goodies and work already starting on what's coming next. And we have Nintendo suing the makers of the Yuzu open source Nintendo Switch emulator. And we also have this message from our sponsor. This video is sponsored by Squarespace, and chances are you all know what Squarespace is, but if you don't, just know that they're your all-in-one solution to create and run your own website. Squarespace has all the tools you need to start your website, improve it, even without knowing anything about code. They have pre-made layouts that you can customize heavily in terms of the colors, of block placement, just by drag and drop. It's really easy to use. You can create all your pages, but you also have plenty of modules, like anything you need to run a store, complete with online payment. You have a members-only area. You have a logo creator. You can even buy your own domain name that you will need to have a serious website straight from Squarespace. So they're your all-in-one platform to let you create and run that website. So to get started with Squarespace, just click the link in the description or head over to squarespace.com/TheLinuxExperiment and you'll get 10% off your first website. So, Nintendo decided to sue the creators of Yuzu, the open source emulator for the Nintendo Switch. The company filed a lawsuit in the US, arguing that there is no legal way to use Yuzu as an emulator, and so that it is, in itself, illegal. Emulation has been a gray area in legal terms for a while, because technically, emulating a game isn't illegal if you own a copy of that game yourself, but running downloaded ROMs is piracy. And sometimes you will also need specific keys or BIOS files to make those emulators run, and obtaining these could be downright impossible without circumventing copyright protections, which might or might not be fair use depending on where you live, and rulings that are generally on a case-by-case basis. So, in the case of Yuzu, Nintendo argues that the emulator needs to run illegally obtained decryption keys, even if you grab them from your own Switch. And so, without these keys, no games could be played. They also say that their license agreement doesn't give you the right to play Switch games on anything other than a Switch. An argument that is pretty weak, as there are a bunch of limitations on what license agreements can impose on users. Nintendo also says that most websites that have pirated copies of their games link to Yuzu as the way to play them, and that Yuzu is profiting from this, earning at least $50,000 in what they call paid downloads, whatever that is in the case of Yuzu, and that also the team's Patreon earns them $30,000 per month, so they're asking for damages and for the courts to shut down the project. On Yuzu's side, there's the fact that the emulator also allows people to play homebrew games that aren't available on Switch, which is definitely a legitimate use case for the continued existence of the tool. It's not just to play pirated Switch games. There's also the fact that Yuzu lets people play games with a controller of their choice, which is a plus for accessibility and could be another valid reason to keep the tool around. And no one should be surprised, right? Nintendo has always been one of the worst gaming companies when it comes to legal action. And there's basically no chance that this thing will go to trial, because unless Yuzu has incredibly deep pockets, there's no way they can fight the army of lawyers that Nintendo has. So we'll see how it goes. They haven't made a public response to Nintendo yet, but hopefully they could manage to win something in this case, so emulation will be considered a bit safer than it is right now, because it's always been pretty gray in terms of whether an emulator will get attacked or not. Now, in the long series of stupid things tech CEOs said, this one might take the cake. Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang argued that coding is no longer a skill that kids should learn, and that people should just not bother anymore because AI will do all the coding by the time that these kids are able to find a job. He instead says that humans should focus on other areas of work, since anyone will be able to code anything by just talking normally with an AI. And yeah, that's just complete nonsense. First, an AI needs code to feed into its model. I'm sure no one would argue that we've reached the peak of the code that could ever be written, that we could never make anything better than we already have. I'm sure no one would also argue that no new programming language would ever see the light of day. So limiting ourselves to the code that's already created, that served to train our pretty mediocre AIs for today, is a very narrow view. Second, if no one knows how to code, who's checking the AI's code or debugging it? Because the current code produced by AI seem to point out that they're not quite able to write well-optimized, secure, or bug-free code. And third, AIs need to be programmed as well. Less developers means less people to work on the actual AI. So what Nvidia CEO is offering is a world where AIs write code for humans without anyone to check it, and letting AIs learn how to improve based on their own code. Not a very enticing world and a pretty nonsensical statement all around. An AI will probably never be able to completely create a full program out of scratch that runs well and doesn't need any human supervision. An AI is a man-made system. It will always need humans in the background to check it. So, KDE Plasma 6 was released this week, and I already have a dedicated video covering all the changes on the channel, but I'll still give you the gist of it here. So, the release moves entirely to Qt 6 and uses Wayland by default. Distros will do whatever they want, they could use X11 instead, but Wayland is now the primary focus, and X11 will still get features, but only if they're doable on this platform and they're not too time-consuming. On top of that base, the desktop saw small improvements to the theme to make it less busy. The settings were reordered and streamlined with less rows of buttons and less nested pages, and you get a new overview effect that is basically exactly GNOME's activities with great touchpad gestures. It's a solid improvement. The desktop cube is back as well. The desktop supports HDR, color profiles, and color blindness correction filters. And the defaults were made easier to grasp for newcomers, with single click by default, tap to click on touchpads, a thumbnail grid in the Alt-Tab switcher, and floating panels by default. And these floating panels gained a much better configuration interface to actually place them on screen as well. KRunner is much faster now and lets you reorder elements around to have the results you want first, and most default apps received improvements as well. It is a very, very good release. On a brand new install using the daily ISOs of Fedora 40, since the second release candidate, I experienced 0 crashes and a very, very limited selection of bugs that didn't break the experience. Other reports seem to say that upgrading KDE Neon in place might generate some issues, so you're probably better off waiting for your distro to give you the actual update with actually well-tested packages. Jacob Kaplan-Moss, one of the main developers on Django, wrote a very interesting blog post on open source funding. It was prompted after he published a Mastodon post denouncing the very usual reactions that a lot of people have when someone tries to make a living writing open source software. Generally, these reactions amount to, "We want people to be able to earn money through open source. Why aren't more people maintaining open source software? But you should not use VC funding, you should not use commercial features, you should not use any form of investment, and you should not work for a large tech company to fund the project." So Jacob basically says that currently, writing open source software is hardly sustainable. Open source projects do not have nearly enough paid maintainers compared to the numbers of users they have. He cites the examples of Python, used by millions of people with only a few full-time developers, or Django, used by hundreds of thousands, and they apparently have less than 2 full-time people working on it. He also points out that, yes, in an ideal world, governments would recognize the crucial mission of open source and the advantages for them, and they would fund open source software instead of giving handouts to big companies. But he also says that we do not live in that world, and that in the meantime, simply pointing out that open source should depend on government funding doesn't solve the problem. He concludes by saying that currently, every way someone can find to develop open source software and get paid for that is a good way, and it's a win, whether it's by a grant, by being employed by a big tech company, by raising capital, or by having paid features. He acknowledges that all of these avenues of funding do have strings attached, But that in our current world, it's either that or no one could ever make a living working on open source, which means less open source software and abandoned projects. It's a very interesting read. I left the link to it in the description of the video, as with all articles I use to make these videos, and I just cannot disagree with him. Like, every time you try to bring money into open source or Linux, there's always a bunch of people saying that it's going to taint the project, no matter how that money is obtained, and no matter that the code is open source, and if something weird happens, it can always be forked and used by someone else instead. And it looks like us Linux users just cannot have nice things because of stupid legal requirements. AMD has been trying for a while to add HDMI 2.1 Plus support to its open source kernel driver for Linux. But apparently the HDMI Forum, being the organization that monitors and controls all things related to the implementations of the HDMI standard, well, that HDMI Forum have rejected all of AMD's efforts. And this lack of support means that, for example, you can't do 4K at 120Hz, or you can't do 5K at 240Hz on Linux with an AMD GPU. Those are not the most common use cases, but it sucks that we can't do it, and it's also a very bad indication that future HDMI progress will not be working on Linux either. And this is all linked to the fact that the HDMI Forum closed public access to the HDMI spec in 2021, meaning that it's now legally complicated or even impossible to implement new HDMI features in open source drivers, because doing so would open the workings of the standard to the public, which the HDMI Forum doesn't want. AMD engineers have spent months working with their legal team trying to come up with a solution, but every effort was turned down, even though they actually produced code to try and satisfy the requirements of the HDMI Forum. And yeah, HDMI is basically the standard everyone uses. On every TV, monitor, GPU, or device, you have something that works with HDMI. So not being able to implement the latest HDMI features in open source drivers is a big problem. So now, if you want to be an absolute open source supporter, you need to ditch HDMI and use DisplayPort, which is apparently a bit more open. Which is dumb. Like, come on, it's a standard. It should be open to everyone. But it's probably a money-related problem or something linked to stupid DRM again. Okay, so let's finish this with the gaming news, and we're going to start with the NVK driver. This is the open source Vulkan driver for Nvidia, and it is now Vulkan 1.3 conformant, meaning that it now supports the latest version of Vulkan. And with that, Mesa 24.1 will build that driver by default and use it instead of flagging it as experimental. Now, to work properly, it requires the latest development snapshot of the Linux kernel 6.8. But when a distro ships 6.8 and Mesa 24.1, you will basically be using Nouveau and NVK out of the box. And that's the first time in a very long while that the open source driver stack for Nvidia will be good and actually usable. On top of that, the NVK developers also started work on a common Vulkan runtime for all Mesa drivers. The goal would be to have a single implementation for stuff like shaders and pipelines, so every driver doesn't have to redevelop all of that stuff when they want to support Vulkan. And this is all really great news. Congrats to the developers who have been moving insanely fast on this new driver, and I cannot wait to get an updated platform to try it out on my Nvidia GPU. And still on the topic of NVK, in Mesa 24.1, they will support rebar, or resizable bar. That's a feature that lets the CPU access the entirety of the GPU's memory to reduce the number of transfers between the two, and thus reduce any bottleneck effect and improve performance. If you don't have support for that, it means that the CPU can only get data from the GPU's memory in little chunks of 256 megabytes, which is obviously suboptimal when you know that modern GPUs tend to have at least 4 gigs of VRAM and can often have 6, 8 or even 12 gigs. So NVK will now be aware of whether your system supports rebar or not, because not all PCIe implementations support that, and they will be able to use it if it's available. And this also works in tandem with the necessary interfaces in the Nouveau driver that will land in the kernel 6.8. And this should bring way better performance for NVK on relatively modern or recent systems that have access to resizable bar. And it also means that maybe the performance of NVK might be good enough that people would consider just not bothering with the proprietary driver. You might lose 15% performance, but at least you don't have any other weird issues around that. And finally, the Wayland driver is getting some more work done, this time with enabling basic OpenGL support. A new merge request will let Wine run OpenGL apps under Wayland natively, although this support is far from complete for now. There's a lot of features still needing to be implemented. Now, the Wayland driver for Wine already supports Vulkan, which is arguably far more important because Wine's primary use case these days is for gaming, and most Linux gaming uses Vulkan. But some games or programs that rely on OpenGL will at least be usable as well. And hopefully that Wayland driver can reach feature parity with the X11 based implementation of Wine and will have one less barrier for the adoption of Wayland by most Linux users. And that's just great news. If this driver can reach feature parity with X11's implementation for Wine, there's basically one less reason to not use Wayland. And actually, it looks like from some earlier testing, running a game with Wine on Wayland natively performs better than running that game with Wine on X11, because Wayland does deliver better latency and better performance in general than that old piece of junk that X11 is that was never designed for modern displays and modern GPUs. So it's good to see more progress on that. And it's also good to tell you about today's sponsor, Tuxedo Computers. If you need a new computer to run Linux on and you don't want to bother trying to check if your hardware will be compatible, trying to remove Windows and making sure that your favorite distro will run well, check out the link in the description below and check out Tuxedo Computers. They make laptops, desktops and NUCs that ship with Linux pre-installed. All the hardware has been picked specifically because it runs well with Linux. And if they encountered some problems in their testing, they submit patches upstream, and for stuff that hasn't yet been accepted, they have repos you can add to support that hardware perfectly. They have a wide range of devices, from little laptops to giant workstations and everything in between, that will cover basically every price point. All of their devices are very customizable, especially laptops. You can put your own logo on the lid, laser etched. You can have your own custom keyboard layout. You can open the laptops, repair them, and upgrade them. They're just great. All my channel and basically everything I do just runs on Tuxedo Computers these days. The channel runs on an Infinity Book Pro 16, and my gaming needs are solved by a Tuxedo Cube, which is basically just a relatively small desktop PC running Holo ISO. So if you need a new computer, you want to support a company that actually supports Linux, click the link in the description below and get yourself a Tuxedo computer. So thanks everyone for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, you know what to do: like button, subscribe button, notification bell, comment section, whatever. And if you really enjoy the channel, I have plenty of links to support it, which will give you some pretty cool benefits as well. So thanks for watching, and I guess you'll see me in the next one. Bye!